The morning he arrived, Eleanor Fairbeck had already been awake for 3 hours. She had risen before the kitchen fire was lit, dressed herself by the light of a single tallow candle rather than waste the good beeswax, and carried the household ledger to the writing table in her father's old study. The study smelled of him still, of leather and pipe tobacco and the particular damp of old paper. And she tried not to notice this as she opened the book and began to copy figures in a clean hand onto a fresh sheet. The figures were not good. They had not been good for 2 years and 4 months, but she had believed, as her father had believed before her, that a clear reckoning honestly presented was worth more than confusion artfully arranged. She would present Mr. Oliver Croft of Croft and Harwick of London with an honest accounting. She would present him with the proposal she had been composing in her head since the letter arrived 12 days ago. She would be precise, and she would be dignified, and she would not permit herself to be afraid. She was 24 years old. The estate of Ashwood carried a debt of £4,000. She had £47 remaining in her household reserve, a younger sister, a housekeeper, and a piano she was not yet willing to sell. She heard the carriage at 10:30. She did not go to the window. The knocker sounded twice. She heard Mrs. Peel's footsteps in the passage, heard the heavy door open, heard a voice she did not know say, "Mr. Croft, to see Miss Fairbeck, regarding the matter of the Croft and Harwick note." Mrs. Peel said, "Will you step into the drawing-room, sir?" "The study will do," the voice said, "if it is all the same." Eleanor stood. She smoothed her dress, gray wool, neat at the collar, the best she owned for receiving, which was not very fine, and she picked up the ledger and the clean sheet of figures. She thought of her father, who had stood in this room for 30 years and received every kind of man. She crossed to the door and opened it herself. Oliver Croft stood in the hall with his hat under his arm and a leather case in his other hand. He was tall and broad-shouldered and wore a dark coat of excellent cut with a high collar and a white cravat tied precisely. His hair was dark and cut close, his jaw clean-shaved, his eyes a gray that admitted no warmth and asked for none. He looked at her with the flat attentiveness of a man who was accustomed to assessing situations rapidly and forming accurate judgments quickly. He did not look at her with anything else. She had expected someone older. She had expected, perhaps without examining the expectation, the sort of man her father's solicitors had been, lined and deliberate and faintly apologetic in the way of men who carry bad news in respectable cases. Croft was none of those things. He was perhaps 34 years old, and he carried himself with the particular stillness of a man who has nothing left to prove in a room, which she recognized as a quality that could be either composure or coldness, and she could not yet determine which. "Miss Fairbeck?" he said. "Mr. Croft," she said. "Come in." She stepped aside. He entered. He glanced once around the room, the desk, the bookshelves, the cold fireplace, the single candle she had not yet replaced, and he did not register any of it as sentiment. He did not comment on the state of the fire or the narrowness of the furnishings, both of which a certain class of visitor treated as an occasion for either sympathy or condescension. He simply sat when she indicated the chair across the desk. She sat. She placed her ledger between them. "I see you are prepared," he said. "I have been prepared for 12 days," she said. Something moved in his face. It was not amusement. It was closer to the recognition of a quality he had not expected to find. It was gone in a moment. He opened his case and produced his own ledger, and she had the odd sensation of looking at her own reflection, slightly distorted. They were, she realized, The same kind of person. Different stations, different resources. The same essential relationship to a column of figures. She did not permit herself to find this comforting. It was as they were concluding the first hour of their interview that Lady Norwood and her daughter passed along the lane outside. Eleanor did not see them. She was copying a figure from one column to another, her head bent, and the window was open 2 inches against the warmth of the morning, and Lady Norwood's voice carried clearly through the old glass, pitched with the particular carelessness of a woman who had never once in her life been required to lower it. "That will be the London man," Lady Norwood said. "Poor creature. She is nothing now but the debt girl. I cannot think what she imagines will come of it." Her daughter said something Eleanor did not catch. Lady Norwood's reply was lost to the sound of the carriage moving on. Eleanor did not stop writing. Her hand did not change its pressure or its pace. She was aware, precisely and without looking up, that he had gone very still on the other side of the desk. "Shall we continue," she said, "to the matter of the proposed extension?" "Yes," he said. His voice was level. "Let us continue. If you have ever watched someone decide not to be diminished by something that would have diminished most people, you know the particular quality of that stillness. Eleanor Fairbank had that quality in abundance. Stay with her, if you will. The next 3 days will ask a great deal of her, but she will not waste one moment of them on self-pity. She had been managing Ashwood since her father's first illness, which had come upon him in the autumn of 1811, when her brother Robert had been 3 months at the Peninsula with his newly purchased commission, and Eleanor had been 21 years old and entirely unprepared. She had learned by necessity. She had learned the names of every tenant, the yield of every field, the state of every fence and cottage roof and drainage ditch on the property. She had learned which suppliers could be trusted, and which would water the terms after an agreement was signed. She had learned to write letters to solicitors, and to read their replies for what they actually meant, rather than what they appeared to say. Robert had died at Salamanca in July of 1812. Her father had received the letter on a Thursday morning in September, and she had watched him fold it and set it down on his writing table, and understood, in the way one understands earthquakes, that the ground had changed. He had gone on for 8 more months, but some essential mechanism in him had ceased. The doctor called it decline of the vital spirits. Eleanor called it grief, which was a simpler word and the truer one. She had put him to bed each night for 8 months and read to him from his old copy of Virgil. And when he was well enough to speak, he would sometimes say that Robert would have liked the passage they were reading, that Robert had always been partial to the second book, and she would agree and turn the page and not let her voice falter. She had, she thought, succeeded in keeping him from knowing how bad the debt had become, which was the last gift she had been able to give him. It was not much. She had given it anyway. He died in May of 1813. The letter from Croft and Harwick arrived in March of 1814, because the old Mr. Croft had himself died in November, and the settlement of his estate had taken some months. The letter informed her that the outstanding note of £4,000, plus accrued interest of £230, was now held by the estate of the younger Mr. Croft, and that he would be visiting Derbyshire on other business in April, and would call upon her at Ashwood on the 14th. She had £47. She had Cecily, who was 17 and entirely lovely, and would require a season in 2 years, if she were to have any prospects at all. She had Mrs. Peel, who had been housekeeper at Ashwood for 30 years, and who had quietly agreed to receive a reduced wage until the situation improved, and who Eleanor suspected would refuse to leave even if asked. She had the estate itself, entailed to a distant cousin named Farrow she had never met, which meant she could not sell it and could not borrow against it, and could, if the debt were called in, be turned out of it. She had her proposal. She had worked on it for 12 days. She had figures to support every element of it, and she had stayed up past midnight twice to verify the arithmetic. He had listened to the proposal. He had asked 7 questions, each of which revealed that he had read every document in his father's file and retained all of it precisely. He had said, at the end, that he would need until the following morning to consider her terms. He would stay at the Lamb and Flag in Morston. He had taken his hat and his case, and gone. Eleanor sat in the study for a long moment after he left. She heard Mrs. Peel in the kitchen. She heard Cecily practicing scales on the piano she was not yet willing to sell. She opened her father's Virgil to the page where the wildflowers were pressed, and she looked at them for a moment, the small papery stars of them, pale now, that had once been blue and white in the long grass of the low field. She closed the book and went to find her sister. At the Lamb and Flag, before the storm, Croft had read through his man of business's notes on the property one final time. Mr. Pine had been thorough, as he always was. The property is entailed to a distant cousin named Farrow, Pine had written. The eldest daughter is considered locally to be nothing more than the debt girl. She has no prospects and no connections, and no guardian remaining. Croft had folded the letter and put it in his case, and thought, as he had thought before, that Pine was precise in his descriptions. He had not thought, then, that Pine could also be precisely wrong. The storm arrived that night. Derbyshire storms in April had a specific character, a quality of suddenly and entirely committed violence, as though the weather had been building to something for months and had at last made up its mind. The rain came sideways, and by morning the Moorstone Bridge was under half a foot of water, and Croft's hired horse had, according to his driver, thrown a shoe on the lane in the dark and come up lame. The driver came to Ashwood in a state of considerable agitation at 7 in the morning to inform Miss Fairbeck of these facts, and to inquire if there was a farrier nearby. There was a farrier in Morston, she said. The bridge, however. The driver looked at her. Your employer, she said carefully, is welcome to shelter here until the bridge is passable. She said it because she had no reasonable alternative. She said it without feeling that she had any choice. She put Mrs. Peel to work on the guest room, and she sent Cecily to the kitchen to manage the breakfast, and she stood in the doorway with her arms folded as the driver went back up the lane to fetch Mr. Croft. He arrived on foot, his coat dark with rain, carrying his case as though he had not noticed the weather. The bridge, he said by way of explanation. I know, she said. Come in. He came in. He stood in the front hall, dripping on the flagstones, and she was briefly and acutely aware that he was larger than the room accounted for, that his presence changed the particular quality of the air in the house in some way she could not have named. You are very kind, he said. He said it like a man who was not accustomed to saying it, and was trying to do it correctly. It is practical, she said. Kindness does not enter into it. He looked at her. Of course, he said. She showed him to the study, because the drawing-room fire smoked in wet weather, and she did not want him to be cold, and then feel that she owed him something for it. She had Mrs. Peel bring coffee. She herself retreated to the kitchen to manage the household and attempted to think of him as a business matter, a fixed figure in a column, and not as a man in a wet coat who had looked at her in the hall with those flat gray eyes that did not appear, upon closer observation, to be entirely without depth. On the second morning of his enforced stay, while Eleanor believed him occupied in the study reviewing figures, Croft walked the property. She did not know this. She had gone to the Hartley cottage at the southern boundary of Ashwood's farmland, where the young couple, Thomas and Mary Hartley, married 18 months and now with a 3-week-old infant named after Eleanor's father, had been sleeping in their neighbor's kitchen since the storm had taken their cottage roof on its eastern side. She had spent the previous morning arranging for timber and the previous afternoon persuading the carpenter in Moorstone, who was owed a small favor from the time she had let him store his supplies in Ashwood's barn, to give the work precedence. She was directing operations. The infant was in her arms because Mary Hartley was needed to point out where the worst of the damage was, and someone needed to hold the child, and there were only the 3 of them. She did not think of it as anything in particular. She thought of it as a morning's work. She shifted the infant to her left arm and held it against her shoulder, while she pointed out to the carpenter with her right hand the section of the east gable where the slate had lifted, and she used the carpenter's name, which was Dunnett, and called him by it twice, and asked after his wife's recovery from her winter cough, and the man had the expression of someone being treated as a person rather than a tool, which was a thing she could not help noticing brought out the best in most people's work. She did not see Croft standing at the edge of the orchard, partially concealed by the old apple trees still bare from winter, watching. He had come out to walk the fields. Habit as much as intention. The habit of a man who assesses things because his profession requires it, and who has assessed so many properties over the years that the action has become automatic. He had seen the group at the cottage from 50 yards away and stopped without deciding to. She did not see his face when the infant reached up and wrapped its fingers around one of the loose ribbons of her cap, and she laughed quietly, without looking up, as though she were entirely alone with something small and complete, and not in need of an audience. He had seen a good many things in his years of calling on properties in default. He had not seen this. She did not see him turn and walk back to the house. She did not see that he walked more slowly on the way back than he had on the way out. He was in the study when she returned. He had covered the desk in papers, orderly, column by column, a different kind of accounting from hers. He looked up when she came in. "The Hartley roof," she said. "I have arranged for the repairs." "From your reserve," he said. She stopped. "You knew." "I reviewed the household accounts, with your permission," he said. "All of them. The repair to the Hartley cottage is not recorded there, but there is a withdrawal that is unaccounted for, and the timing corresponds." He said it without expression. She could not tell if he was reproaching her or simply reporting. "The family had a newborn," she said. "It was not possible to leave them without a roof." "No," he said. "I expect it was not." She waited. "Miss Fairbeck," he said, and then he stopped. He looked down at the papers before him. His hand rested near the spine of her father's Virgil, which she had left on the corner of the desk, and now wished she had put away, because it felt suddenly like something private, and he was a stranger, or close enough to one. "This book," he said. He did not touch it, but his fingers were near it. "It belonged to your father." "Yes." "The flowers," he said. "He planted wildflowers in the low field," she said. "He said they were native to the valley and ought not to be pulled out for the sake of a tidy-looking pasture." She stopped. She had not intended to say all of that. Croft was quiet for a moment. "My father," he said, and then he was also quiet. He looked at the ledger in front of him. "My father had a motto: a debt is a contract, and a contract is a man's word. He lived by it entirely." A pause. "He was right that contracts matter. He was wrong, I think, about the extent to which a man can live entirely within them." She did not speak. She understood. In the particular way one sometimes understands things that have not been fully said, that he was offering her something he did not ordinarily offer. She was careful with it. You were engaged once, she said. It was not a question. She had heard something to that effect from Mrs. Peel, who heard everything from everyone in Derbyshire by some mechanism Eleanor had never been able to identify. He looked at her. Yes. And the engagement was dissolved. By her family, he said. When it became clear that Croft and Harwick's money came from trade rather than from land, and that no amount of Oxford would change that fact, he said it with perfect evenness, the way a man says a thing he has said to himself so many times it has worn smooth. I decided, afterward, that I preferred clear terms to unclear ones, that a balance sheet, properly kept, produced fewer surprises than a drawing room. She looked at him. She thought of Lady Norwood's voice through the window. She thought of the baby's fingers around her ribbon. A balance sheet can be wrong, she said. You can enter a figure incorrectly and not see the error for months because everything else has been arranged around it. Something shifted in his face. It was the first time she had seen it move in a way that was not controlled, and it was brief, no more than a breath's worth. But she noted it the way she noted the condition of every fence on the property, with the attentiveness of someone who has learned that small things matter. Yes, he said, that is true. She thought, later, that this was the moment. Not the reversal, not the public scene, not the mourning that came after. This moment, in her father's study, with the Virgil on the desk between them and the rain still moving against the windows, the two of them equally tired, and equally precise, and equally wrong about one thing each. She could not have said any of that to him then. They were not yet entitled to that kind of speech. She thought it precisely, and she believed he thought something close to it. And they sat with it in the shared silence of the study until Mrs. Peel came to say that supper was ready. If you have ever waited for something you could not name to become something you could, you know how that silence felt. Stay with it for just a moment longer. On the morning of the third day, the bridge was passable. Eleanor had made her decision during the night. She had lain awake in the dark, and she had thought about the Hartley cottage, and the wild flowers, and the balance sheet that had an entry she could not see. She had thought about Cecily, who wanted to play the piano, and not spend her girlhood in a house managed down to the candle stubs. She had thought about her father's motto, which had not been her father's motto at all, but which she had taken for her own, a clear reckoning honestly presented. She met him in the study at 8 a.m. He had his case packed. He was standing when she came in. She said, "I have a revised proposal." He looked at her. She said it clearly, without preamble. A marriage, not a love match. She was not asking him to pretend to anything he did not feel. A legal arrangement in which the debt of £4,230 would convert to her portion, Cecily would have the means for a proper season. Ashwood would remain in the family until the cousin could be compelled by the entails terms to make a settlement. He would have, for whatever use he might make of it, a wife with a family name that the county recognized, which was a kind of currency she understood he had been denied. She finished. She waited. His face was entirely still. "You are proposing," he said, "a business arrangement." "Yes," she said. "That is a very unusual proposal, Miss Fairbeck." "I am aware," she said. "I have reviewed several precedents in the legal literature. The terms are defensible." He looked at her for a long moment. The case was in his hand. Outside, she heard a horse on the lane. His driver returned from the farrier. "I cannot accept," he said. She said nothing. "It is not," he said carefully, "because the terms are unreasonable. It is because I said, a long time ago, that I would not marry. Not for convenience, not for strategy." His jaw was tight. "I have been proved a fool in a drawing room once, Miss Fairbeck." I do not intend to be proved a fool in a study. I am not asking you to be a fool, she said. No, he said. You are not. He looked at her for another moment, the gray eyes measuring, and then he picked up his case. I will write to you regarding the extension of the note. You will have my terms within a fortnight. He left. She heard his boots in the passage, heard the door open and close, heard the carriage on the lane. She stood in the study until the sound was gone. Then she sat down and opened the ledger to a blank page and wrote, in her clearest hand, the beginning of a new column of figures, because there was nothing else to do. Sir Frederick Halse arrived at Ashwood 9 days after Croft departed. Sir Frederick was 53 years old, red-faced, and possessed of a confidence in his own judgment that his judgment had never done much to earn. He had a land claim against the northeastern boundary of Ashwood, disputed since her father's time, which had been entered into chancery and was unlikely to be resolved in any direction for another decade. He arrived with his solicitor, a small gray man named Spicer, who said nothing and wrote everything down, and he sat in Eleanor's drawing room with his hat on his knee and explained to her what he called the situation. The situation, as Sir Frederick described it, was this. He had spoken with certain parties in London, and he understood that the Croft and Harwick note was in some difficulty regarding resolution. Miss Fairbeck must be aware of her position. Sir Frederick was a reasonable man, a neighbor, a friend of the late Mr. Fairbeck. He was prepared to purchase the note from Croft and Harwick at its face value and to settle it entirely in exchange for a modest accommodation, namely that Miss Fairbeck would agree to accept an offer of marriage from his son, Edmund. He said it pleasantly. He said it in the tone of a man doing a great favor. Eleanor looked at Mr. Spicer's pen moving across the paper. She thought of Edmund Halse, who was 31 and had been twice inebriated at church, who had said to her at a neighbor's dinner the previous October that he admired a woman who knew when she was out of options, and had said it while looking at her in a way she had felt at the back of her neck. I appreciate your concern, Sir Frederick, she said. I must decline. Sir Frederick stopped smiling. He left with his solicitor and his hat and his assessment of her situation, and he told her, at the door, that she was a proud creature for a woman in her circumstances, and that pride was a poor shelter against a debt collector. He said it with a particular curl at the corner of his mouth that she recognized as the expression of a man who has not been refused before and does not plan to accept it quietly. She went to the study. She sat at the desk. She picked up her pen. She wrote a letter to Croft. It was not the letter she wanted to write. The letter she wanted to write would have said that she had been wrong to propose it as a business arrangement, that it was not actually a business arrangement in her own mind, that 3 days in her father's study had constituted, in some particular and frightening way, the most honest conversation she had had since her father died. It would have said that she thought he was a man who had learned to live inside a very small perimeter, and that she understood this because she had done the same, and that the perimeter was not, in her considered judgment, the whole of what either of them was. She did not write that letter. She did not write it because she could not send it. And writing a letter one cannot send is a form of cruelty turned inward. She wrote instead that she released him from any consideration of her proposal. She wrote that she had found another resolution to the matter of the note, and that he was not required to extend terms he found inconvenient. She wished him well in his affairs, and she thanked him for his time at Ashwood. She read it over twice. It was accurate in every particular, except the one that mattered. She sealed the letter and gave it to Mrs. Peel to send. Mrs. Peel held it for a moment and looked at her with the expression of a woman who has been a housekeeper at Ashwood for 30 years, and had therefore outlasted one form of grief already, and did not require anyone to explain the shape of a second. She did not say anything. She went to arrange the sending of it. She did not tell Mrs. Peel that she had not actually found another resolution, only that she would not accept Sir Frederick's offer, regardless of what became of the note, and that this meant she was running out of time. The Moorstone Assembly that Friday was the first of the spring season. Eleanor did not want to attend. Cecily said, "Nell, you cannot stay in the house forever." And Mrs. Peel said nothing but set out the blue muslin dress that was Eleanor's best without being asked. Eleanor put it on and told herself it was for Cecily's sake, that the girl deserved some society, that there was no shame in showing one's face in the village when one had done nothing wrong. The assembly room at the Lamb and Flag was warm and brightly lit, candles in every sconce, the smell of beeswax and powder, and the particular cheerful noise of people who had been shut in by the same April weather. Eleanor came in with Cecily on her arm, and the room absorbed them with the moderate interest it extended to all its familiar members. Halse was there. He was standing near the fireplace with two of his neighbors, and he saw her come in, and his expression arranged itself into the particular shape of a man with a speech prepared. He crossed the room before she had taken off her outer coat. "Miss Fairbeck," he said, loudly enough to carry. "Still keeping up appearances, I see. One must admire the persistence, if not the judgment." A few heads turned. "Miss Fairbeck," he said again, still at that carrying volume, "has recently declined a very generous offer, gentlemen, on account of a pride that her circumstances do not strictly support. The debt girl, you see, is particular about her rescuers." The room was very quiet. Cecily's hand tightened on Eleanor's arm. Eleanor kept her face smooth. She thought of her father's copy of Virgil. She thought of the wild flowers in the low field. She thought that she had not spent 3 years managing Ashwood down to the candle stubs in order to crumble in front of his fireplace. She took one breath, and the door opened. He was not a man who entered rooms dramatically. He came in as he did everything else, with the economy of a man who has only the movements he intends to make, and he was still in his traveling coat, and there was road dust on his boots. He had, it was plain, come directly from his carriage. He had not stopped at the inn. He saw her across the room. He saw Halse. He saw the shape of the scene with the same rapid accuracy he brought to a column of figures. He walked across the room in 3 strides. He stopped beside her, not in front of her, and the distinction was precise, the difference between protecting someone and placing yourself between them and the world, which is a thing one does for a child, and standing with someone, which is a thing one does for an equal. He looked at Sir Frederick Halse. He said, "She is not the debt. She is my wife." The room was entirely silent for a moment. Sir Frederick's expression cycled through several stages of confusion before settling on a bright, unpleasant red. "Your wife," he said. "Yes," Croft said. "As of this morning, by special license. I have the document in my case." He looked at Halse with the flat gray eyes that, Eleanor now understood, were not without depth, but simply deep in the manner of wells, rather than of pools, cold and clear, all the way down. "The note of £4,230 from Croft and Harwick has been discharged and retired as of the 14th of April. You will find no purchase to be made there." He did not look at Halse again. He turned to Eleanor. She was looking at him. She was, for the first time in as long as she could remember, entirely at a loss for what to say. She was aware that the room was watching. She was more aware of the document he had mentioned, and of what it meant that he had not sent it, but brought it himself, and of the particular quality of his face when he said the word wife, which was not the face of a man speaking a business arrangement. "You came back," she said. "Yes," he said. "The letter," she said. "I released you." "You released me," he said, "from a proposal I refused. You said nothing about the one I intended to make. She looked at him. She was aware that the room could hear them, all of it, and she found that she did not particularly mind. You said, she said carefully, that you did not intend to be proved a fool in a study. I have reconsidered, he said. His voice was level, but there was something in it she had not heard before, something that had not been there through the ledgers and the proposals and even the conversation about the Virgil book, something that cost him in a way that was visible if you knew where to look. And she knew where to look now. A balance sheet, properly kept, produces fewer surprises than a drawing room. You told me a balance sheet can still be wrong. You were correct. A pause. I had an error in one column. It took me 9 days to find it. Cecily made a very small sound beside her. Mrs. Peel was not present, but Eleanor was certain she would hear about this before morning. She looked at him in his traveling coat with the road dust on his boots and the special license in his case, and she thought of the morning he had stood in her father's orchard and watched her hold a baby. She had no particular reason to hold, and of the evening in the study, when he had said his father's motto, with the evenness of a man who has worn something smooth, and of the letter she had written releasing him from something he had not asked to be released from. She thought of the wild flowers in the low field, pressing their thin shapes into the pages of her father's Virgil. She said, "You are aware that Ashwood is entailed." "I am aware," he said, "and that the cousin will inherit regardless." "I know how entails work, Miss Fairbeck." He stopped. "Mrs. Croft." He said her new name as though he were trying its weight, and she felt, in the pit of her chest, something unlock that she had not known was locked. "You may call me Eleanor," she said. "Eleanor," he said. It came out quietly, in his level voice, and it was the first time she had heard her own name from him, and she understood why it was marked as a significant event, because it was. Halsey said something else. She did not catch it. She was looking at the road dust on his boots and thinking, with a clarity that surprised her, that a man does not travel in a carriage for 6 hours without stopping at the inn if he is still a stranger. She thought of Pine's letter, and of how he had written that she had no prospects and no connections. She thought of the word Halsey had used. The debt girl. She thought of all the columns in all the ledgers she had kept for 3 years, each one of them a reckoning, an honest accounting, a refusal to let the figure be other than what it was. And she thought that this man, who had arrived in her county to collect what was owed him, and had stood in her father's study and said a balance sheet can still be wrong, had just walked into a room full of people who had already decided what she was worth, and announced, in 11 words, that they were incorrect. She put her hand on his arm. His hand came up and covered hers, not in a flourish, not in a declaration, simply in the way of a man who has made a decision and is not going to unmake it. The warmth of it went through her glove. "Take me home," she said. "Yes," he said. They were married. You know they were married. The license said so. The one in his case with the ink not yet a week dry, procured in London by a man who had told himself for 9 years that contracts were cleaner than feelings, and had discovered, on the 9th day of writing figures in a quiet office, that some columns cannot be closed without the correct entry. He had left London with the license and no very clear plan beyond the one that brought him north. Ashwood was dark when they returned. Cecily stayed at the Lamb and Flag with the Norwood girls because she was 17 and full of practical wisdom about when to be elsewhere. Mrs. Peel had left a fire in the drawing room and a candle on the table in the front hall. Croft stood in the entrance of his wife's house and looked at it by candlelight, And she understood, watching his face, that he was a man who had not expected to have a house like this, ever. A house that smelled of someone's father and old books, and the particular quiet of a family that had loved a piece of ground for generations. The landed class had refused him. Here was the land. Here was the family. Here was the kitchen fire that would need banking before morning. She said, "Come in then." He came in. She put down her coat. She was going to say something practical. Something about the supper that would be cold by now. The necessity of sending for Cecily before midnight. She was going to manage it the way she managed everything, with the ledger in her head and the figures clear. But she stopped. Because on the desk in the study, visible through the open door in the firelight, was the Virgil. She went to it without deciding to. She opened it to the page with the wildflowers, and she carried it back and set it on the small table near the drawing-room fire, between where she stood and where he stood, and the firelight caught the paper petals, pale and old, and she thought of the long grass of the low field in the summer, before the debt, before the army, before the particular form that grief takes in a family when it loses more than one thing at once. She said, "He planted them every spring, along the south boundary. He said it did not matter that they were only wildflowers. He said they were native to the valley, and they deserved to stay." He looked at the flowers. He looked at them for a long time. "I'm sorry," he said, "that I did not know him." She had not expected that. She had expected the balanced sentence, the precise measurement. Not this, which was too simple and too true for a ledger. "So am I," she said. He put his hand out, very slowly, and touched the edge of one of the pressed flowers without moving it. A careful touch. The touch of a man who has been told all his life to keep his hands out of what does not belong to him, and is, for once, proceeding without that instruction. "May I keep this safe?" he said, and he did not mean only the book. She looked at him. The fire was warm. The room was quiet. Outside, somewhere down the lane, the low field was dark, and the wildflowers were 3 months from their season, pressing up through soil that was cold, yet waiting for the particular quality of May light on the valley's face to call them up. "Yes," she said. The book stayed on the table between them. The fire burned down to coals, and then to a glow, and the room was warm. By the following spring, the low field was in flower. If this story has kept you company this evening, leave a word below, and tell us which moment stayed with you. Thank you for staying until the end.